The glint of gold against cheap, faded velvet was the first thing to catch his eye. It was an anomaly, a star fallen into a gutter. Adrian Vance, a man who moved through the world insulated by wealth and precision, stopped dead on the crowded sidewalk. Pedestrians flowed around him like a river around a stone, but he saw only the blanket spread on the concrete, a sad little island of second-hand junk, tarnished silver plate lockets, a chipped porcelain doll with one eye, mismatched cufflinks. And there, nestled between a dog-eared paperback and a plastic toy soldier, was his watch. It wasn't a watch. It was the watch. The Patek Philippe Calibre 89, a unique commission, a ghost he had been chasing for 25 years. Its face, a universe of tiny, interlocking gears and celestial dials, was as familiar to him as his own reflection. It was the last piece of his father, the only piece. The seller was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 17. She was thin and pale, her shoulders hunched against the city's indifferent chill. A threadbare cardigan pulled tight around her. Her eyes, wide and weary, scanned the faces of the passers-by with a desperate hope that was painful to watch. Adrian felt a cold, sharp anger crystallize in his chest. He strode over, his shadow falling across her meager display. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, stripped of its usual boardroom polish. The girl flinched, her eyes snapping to his. Fear, pure and primal, washed over her face. She didn't look like a thief. She looked like prey. Her hand instinctively shot out, not to flee, but to cover the watch, to protect it. "It's not for sale," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, a ridiculous lie given her situation. Her gaze darted from his expensive handmade shoes to his tailored suit, and the fear in her eyes curdled into sheer terror. Adrian's own gaze dropped to her protective hand, and he saw it, a small silver-framed photograph clutched in her other hand, the edges worn smooth. A man with kind eyes and a familiar, faint smile. The blood drained from Adrian's face. He knew that smile. He knew that watchmaker's stance. The world tilted on its axis, the city noise fading to a dull roar in his ears. The impossible, gut-wrenching truth was taking shape before the question had even fully formed in his mind. He knelt, his knee cracking in protest on the cold pavement, ignoring the stares of the crowd. He pointed a trembling finger not at the watch but at the photograph. "Who is that?" he demanded, his voice ragged with a ghost of a memory. The girl clutched the photo tighter to her chest, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "That's my father," she whispered. "He told me this watch would save us." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two worlds. Adrian felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground of his life had turned to quicksand. His father. She'd said her father. The anger that had been a pillar of fire in his gut for over 2 decades flickered, threatening to dissolve into a bewildering fog. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He would find the thief, a shadowy figure from the dregs of the city, and he would deliver a cold, swift justice. He would reclaim the last tangible piece of his past and finally close that bleeding wound. He had never imagined the thief would have a face like this, young, terrified, and heartbreakingly sincere. He never imagined the thief would be a ghost, represented by a daughter with eyes that held the same quiet sorrow he remembered from his own childhood. He forced himself to focus, to push back the encroaching chaos of emotion, logic, facts. Those were the tools that had built his empire, the fortress walls he'd constructed around the hollow space in his heart. "That's impossible," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "This watch belonged to my father. It was stolen from him 25 years ago." The girl, whose name he would later learn was Lily, shook her head, a frantic, desperate motion. "No, my dad. He was a watchmaker. He made this. It was his masterpiece. He passed away 2 months ago. He gave it to me. He said it was the most important thing he'd ever touched. Her voice cracked on the last words, the grief still raw and gaping. She was a terrible liar, or she was telling a truth so profound it defied all of Adrian's certainties. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the delicate skin of her throat. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid for something far more important. His eyes scanned her again, taking in the worn-out sneakers, the faint purple shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. This wasn't the act of a common grifter. This was desperation, pure and unvarnished. "Why are you selling it?" He pressed, his voice softening slightly, a crack in the icy facade. If it was so important to him, why sell it on a sidewalk? Lily's chin trembled, and she finally broke eye contact, looking down at the worn photograph in her hand. Her shoulders shook with a sob she was trying to suppress. "My brother," she whispered, the words so quiet he had to lean in to hear them over the city's hum. "Leo. He's sick. Very sick. We need money for the hospital, for a surgery. The doctors said. They said we don't have much time." The confession tumbled out of her in a rush, each word a heavy stone she was forced to lay down. It was the kind of story Adrian had trained himself to dismiss, the boilerplate sob story of every con artist in the city. But as he looked at her, at the genuine anguish etched into her young face, he felt his cynicism begin to crumble. He saw not a liar, but a mirror. He saw the same desperation he'd felt as a boy, alone and helpless, when the world had taken everything from him. The watch had been his symbol of that loss. For her, it was a symbol of hope. The irony was a bitter pill. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over the watch. "May I?" he asked. It wasn't a question of permission, but a test. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her entire body tensing, then gave a small, defeated nod. Her hand, trembling, retreated from the watch. Adrian picked it up. The weight of it was a jolt, a memory embedded in his very cells. It was heavier than gold. It was the weight of a life's work, of a father's dream. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the familiar, intricate engraving on the back. A complex celestial chart, intertwined with two sets of initials, R.V. and T.K. Robert Vance, and T.K. His mind raced. He had always assumed the second set of initials belonged to a forgotten craftsman or an engraver. But what if they stood for something else? What if the story of the watch wasn't as simple as he'd believed? "What was your father's name?" he asked, his voice tight. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Thomas Keller. T.K." The initials burned into his thumb. The world stopped. The fortress he had built around his heart, stone by painful stone, didn't just crack. It shattered. The narrative of his life, the one that had fueled his ambition and justified his hardness, was a lie. Or at the very least it was a story with a missing chapter, a chapter whose protagonist was the man in the photograph, and whose epilogue was this desperate girl selling his legacy for a brother's life. He couldn't call the police. He couldn't just walk away. He was tethered to this girl, to her story. By the intricate, unseen gears of a past he suddenly realized he knew nothing about. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the echo of his own father's kindness in her eyes. He made a decision, a swift, impulsive act that went against every principle by which he lived. He pulled out his wallet, the supple black leather a stark contrast to the gritty pavement. He took out all the cash he had, several $1,000s, meant for a frivolous art auction later that day. He pressed the thick wad of bills into her hand. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her hand closing around the money as if it were a dream she was afraid would evaporate. "Go," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Go to your brother. This should be enough for now." Lily stared at him, speechless, tears streaming freely down her face now, washing clean trails on her dusty cheeks. But the watch. "I'm keeping it," Adrian said, his voice firm, though his insides were in turmoil. "Consider this a deposit. I need to understand what this means. I need to know who your father was." He stood up, his joints aching. The city came rushing back in, the sounds, the smells, the relentless motion. But for him, everything had changed. He held the watch in his hand, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the wild, erratic beating of his own heart. He had spent his life chasing a ghost, only to find that the ghost had a family, a story, and a legacy of its own that was inextricably, impossibly tangled with his. He walked away from the girl on the sidewalk, not with the cold satisfaction of justice he had always imagined, but with the terrifying, earth-shattering burden of a truth he was just beginning to uncover. The weight of the watch in his pocket felt heavier than ever, no longer just a symbol of his past, but the key to a future he could never have conceived. Back in the sterile silence of his penthouse apartment, the city lights glittering like a galaxy of cold diamonds below, Adrian placed the watch on a polished obsidian desk. It lay there under the stark gallery lighting, a relic from another life. His life. The apartment was his sanctuary, a monument to his success. It was a space of clean lines, minimalist art, and vast empty spaces. A physical manifestation of the man he had become. Controlled, orderly, and devoid of personal clutter. He had no photographs, no sentimental trinkets. He had long ago decided that attachments were weaknesses, that nostalgia was a poison that paralyzed you from moving forward. The only exception had been the memory of this watch, an obsession that had become the central, driving force of his existence. Now the object of that obsession was here, and instead of feeling a sense of triumph, he felt a profound and unsettling emptiness. The silence of the apartment, usually a comfort, was now accusatory. It echoed with the ghost of the girl's whispered words, with the phantom ticking of the watch, with the unanswered questions that were piling up like a debt he didn't know how to pay. Who was Thomas Keller? And how had he come to possess Robert Vance's masterpiece? Adrian poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He sank into a leather armchair that cost more than a car and stared at the watch. His father, Robert, had been a dreamer. While other fathers taught their sons to throw a ball, his had taught him the language of escapements and tourbillons. Their tiny, cluttered workshop, smelling of oil and metal polish, had been his entire world. He remembered his father's hands, calloused and stained but impossibly gentle as they manipulated minuscule screws and springs. He had been a genius, an artist whose medium was time itself. The Caliber 89 wasn't just a watch, it was his symphony. He'd poured years of his life into it, working late into the night, his face illuminated by the glow of his work lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was going to be their salvation, the piece that would finally lift them from the quiet desperation of their finances. "This isn't just about telling time, Adrian," he'd told him, his voice filled with a passion that had made the very air in the workshop vibrate. "It's about capturing it. It's about holding the stars in your hand." Then, just as he was on the verge of securing a buyer, he was gone. A sudden, senseless aneurysm. One moment he was there, sketching a new design for a balance wheel, and the next, he was a cold, still absence. Adrian, at 12 years old, was left with nothing but the grief and the watch. The watch was taken to a reputable appraiser, a necessary step for the estate, and it vanished. The appraiser claimed it was stolen in a brazen daylight robbery. The police found no leads. Adrian was sent into the unforgiving labyrinth of the foster care system, and the watch became a legend, a symbol of everything that had been stolen from him. his father, his future, his name. The boy who was Adrian Vance died in that system, and a new one was forged in the fires of anger and ambition. He'd aged out of the system with a ferocious determination, worked menial jobs while putting himself through night school, clawing his way into the world of finance with a ruthlessness that shocked his competitors. He'd built his empire with the single-minded goal of becoming powerful enough to reclaim what was his. He wanted to buy back his past, to own the one thing that connected him to the man who had taught him how to hold the stars in his hand. And now, the story had a new character: Thomas Keller. Adrian's fingers went to his laptop, the quiet clicks of the keys unnaturally loud in the silent room. He was a man of resources. If Thomas Keller existed, Adrian would find him. He hired the best private investigation firm his money could buy, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient agency he usually reserved for corporate espionage. The instructions were simple. Find everything there is to know about a watchmaker named Thomas Keller. Deceased 2 months. 2 children, Lily and Leo. The name of the hospital Lily had mentioned was seared into his memory. He dispatched a separate, anonymous inquiry there, arranging for the boy's medical records to be sent to a trusted physician for review and ensuring, through a carefully veiled donation, that the immediate financial pressures were lifted. He told himself it was a tactical move, a way to verify the girl's story. If she had lied about her brother, then everything else was a lie. But he knew with a certainty that unsettled him that it was more than that. It was an involuntary act of compassion, a reflex he thought he'd stamped out of himself long ago. The image of her desperate, tear-streaked face was superimposed over his own memories of helplessness. The next few days were a strange kind of purgatory. Adrian went through the motions of his life: board meetings, market analyses, portfolio reviews. But his mind was elsewhere. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by a past that was refusing to stay buried. He found himself staring at the watch for hours, its intricate face a map to a country he no longer recognized. He'd always seen it as a symbol of his father's solitary genius. Now he saw the initials, R, V, and TK, and wondered about the partnership, the friendship he had never known. Was Thomas Keller a brilliant partner, or a Judas who had stolen his friend's legacy? The first report from the investigators landed in his secure inbox late one night. It was a preliminary background check, a sketch of a life lived in the shadows. Thomas Keller had been a watchmaker, just as Lily had said. A brilliant one, according to the scattered anecdotes they'd managed to collect from old colleagues and shop owners. He was described as quiet, meticulous, and intensely private. He had worked for several high-end repair shops in his youth before suddenly dropping off the grid for a few years. He re-emerged with a wife and a young daughter, opening his own small, unassuming repair shop in a modest neighborhood, a place that catered to fixing sentimental heirlooms, not luxury brands. He never sought acclaim, never patented his own designs, and lived a life of quiet, hand-to-mouth obscurity. It was the profile of a man hiding from something. The report contained a list of his former employers. Adrian's blood ran cold when he saw the name of one of the shops: Geneva Masters, a prestigious and now defunct appraiser and repair house. It was the same company that had been handling his father's watch when it was stolen. The timeline was damning. Thomas Keller had quit his job at Geneva Masters one day after the reported theft, citing a family emergency. He'd never worked in the high-end watch world again. There it was, the cold, hard logic he'd been seeking. Thomas Keller wasn't a partner. He was the thief. The story Lily had told him was a lie, a fairy tale her father had spun to cover his crime. The anger returned, hot and familiar, a welcome shield against the confusing swirl of other emotions. He had been a fool to feel a flicker of sympathy, a fool to see himself in that girl's desperate eyes. She was the daughter of the man who had ruined his life, raised on the proceeds of a stolen legacy. He picked up the watch, the metal feeling cold and dead in his hand now. He had his answer. He could go to the police, expose Thomas Keller's crime, and reclaim his property. Justice, after 25 years, was within his grasp. But it felt hollow. Exposing a dead man would accomplish nothing but devastate his children. Children who were, through a twisted stroke of fate, now under his unwitting protection. The physician's report on Leo Keller had come back. It was grim. The boy had a rare congenital heart defect, one that required a complex and astronomically expensive series of surgeries. Lily hadn't been lying about that. Her desperation was real. The money Adrian had given her was a drop in the ocean of what they would need. He was trapped in a web of his own making. He stood on his balcony, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm inside him. The city below was a relentless, uncaring machine, a world of winners and losers, a world he had mastered. But this wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was a tangled mess of human lives, of grief and guilt and love. He looked back at the watch on his desk. His father had taught him that the most complex movements were also the most delicate. One piece out of place, one gear misaligned, and the entire mechanism would fail. His own life, so carefully calibrated, was now completely out of alignment. He had to see her again. He had to go to the hospital. He had to look into the eyes of the thief's daughter and understand how a man could commit such a profound betrayal and then raise a child who seemed so full of love and sorrow. He needed to see the legacy of Thomas Keller for himself before he decided what to do about the legacy of Robert Vance. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, a smell Adrian recognized from the last days of his father's life. It was a place where time was measured not in seconds and minutes, but in the anxious beats of a heart, in the slow drip of an IV bag. He'd avoided places like this for most of his adult life, associating them with the ultimate powerlessness. Yet here he was, walking down a brightly lit corridor, his expensive shoes silent on the polished linoleum, feeling more out of place than he ever had in any foreign boardroom. He found Leo Keller's room at the end of a wing in the pediatric cardiac unit. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the soft, rhythmic beep of a monitor. He paused, an unfamiliar hesitation gripping him. He was about to cross a threshold into a world he had no right to enter, armed with a truth that could shatter it completely. He pushed the door open. The room was small, dominated by a hospital bed that seemed too large for the little boy lost within it. Leo was pale and frighteningly still, a tangle of wires and tubes connecting him to the machines that were keeping him alive. He looked to be about 8 or 9, with a mop of dark hair and a face that, even in sleep, held a hint of his sister's features. Lily was in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on the mattress, her hand clutching her brother's. She was asleep, her face etched with an exhaustion so deep it seemed to have settled into her very bones. The threadbare cardigan was draped over her shoulders like a security blanket. The scene was one of quiet, heartbreaking devotion. There was no artifice here, no performance. This was real. This was the desperation she had spoken of, a vigil born of love and fear. Adrian's righteous anger began to feel coarse and out of place in the quiet sanctity of this room. This wasn't the den of a thief's heir, living off stolen luxury. This was a shrine to a sibling's love, paid for with sleepless nights and sidewalk begging. He stood there for a long moment, an intruder in their private grief. He should have turned around, left them to their struggle. But he couldn't. He was bound to them. He quietly pulled the door shut and went to find the head of the department, a renowned surgeon whose foundation Adrian had, by sheer coincidence, donated a significant sum to the previous year. He introduced himself, and the surgeon's professional demeanor immediately warmed with recognition. Adrian cut straight to the point. He wanted to know about Leo Keller. He wanted the truth, unvarnished. The surgeon, Dr. Aris Thorne, a man with weary but kind eyes, led him to his office. He pulled up Leo's file, the screen glowing with complex medical charts and somber prognoses. "It's a tough case," Thorne admitted, his voice low. "Tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. A mouthful, I know. Essentially, he was born with a collection of structural heart defects. We've managed it with smaller procedures over the years, but he's at a tipping point. He needs a full conduit replacement, a very high-risk, very expensive operation. Without it—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "His sister believes she can pay for it," Adrian stated, watching the doctor's face. Thorne let out a sad, tired sigh. "Lily. She's a remarkable young woman. She's been his primary caregiver since their mother passed a few years ago, and now their father. She's fiercely protective. She comes in here with handfuls of cash, a few $100s at a time, and insists on paying down the bill. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The cost of this surgery is in the hundreds of thousands. We've been trying to get him approved for charitable assistance, but there's a long waiting list, and his condition is deteriorating faster than the bureaucracy moves." Adrian felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. Here was the brutal math of the world. A child's life weighed against a balance sheet. It was a calculus he understood, one he'd used to build his fortune. But seeing it applied to this small boy, to that fiercely protective sister, made him feel a surge of something akin to shame. "I want to cover it," Adrian said, the words leaving his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. "All of it, anonymously. Set up a fund, a grant, whatever you need to do. Just ensure that boy gets his surgery, and that his sister is never presented with another bill." Dr. Thorne stared at him, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Mr. Vance, that is incredibly generous. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Adrian cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Just get it done. I want the best team, the best care. Money is not an object." He left the doctor's office feeling a strange sense of lightness, as if he'd just shed a great weight. It was the most impulsive, least logical financial decision he had ever made. It was not an investment. There was no return, no angle to play. It was a pure, unadorned act, and it felt more meaningful than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. He returned to Leo's room. Lily was awake now, bathing her brother's forehead with a damp cloth, her movements gentle and practiced. She looked up as he entered, and the fear returned to her eyes, sharper this time, mixed with a weary defiance. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a fierce whisper, trying not to wake her brother. "I came to talk about your father," Adrian said, his voice quiet. He pulled up a chair, creating a space between them, a no-man's land of unspoken accusations. "I know he worked at Geneva Masters. I know he left the day after my father's watch was stolen from their vault." Lily's face went pale. She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white where she gripped the cloth. She didn't deny it. She didn't act surprised. She just seemed to shrink in on herself, a terrible, resigned sadness washing over her. "So you think he was a thief?" she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question. "The evidence is compelling," Adrian said, choosing his words carefully. "He was a brilliant watchmaker. My investigators said so. Why would a man like that spend his life fixing cheap Timexes in a back alley shop? Why would he hide?" "He wasn't hiding," Lily said, her head snapping up, a flash of fire in her eyes. "He was protecting us. He was a good man, the best man. He was gentle and kind, and he loved us more than anything. He worked his fingers to the bone to make sure we had food on the table, to pay for Leo's first few surgeries. He never had a nice thing for himself. Ever. That watch was the only beautiful thing he ever owned, and he looked at it with such sadness. Does that sound like a man enjoying a stolen treasure? Her passionate defense was a blow to his certainty. He had come here to confront her with the facts, to see her crumble under the weight of her father's crime. But she wasn't crumbling. She was fighting for his memory with a conviction that was absolute. Perhaps he regretted it, Adrian offered, the thought occurring to him for the first time. Perhaps he was ashamed. He wasn't ashamed of anything, Lily insisted, though a shadow of doubt flickered in her eyes. He was haunted. There was a sadness in him he never spoke of. After Mom died, it got worse. He would lock himself in his workshop for hours, just sitting there, holding the watch. Sometimes I'd hear him talking to himself, about a promise, about a friend. A friend? Adrian leaned forward, his heart starting to beat faster. Did he ever mention a name? Lily frowned, searching her memory. Robert, I think. He used to say it sometimes. I'm sorry, Robert. I'll make it right. Robert. The name was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 25 years. It wasn't the talk of a thief gloating over his prize. It was the lament of a man burdened by a secret. Lily, Adrian said, his voice softer now. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to tarnish your father's memory. I just want the truth. My entire life has been shaped by the loss of that watch and the loss of my father. If your dad, if he knew him, I need to know how. He could see the conflict warring in her face, her fierce loyalty to her father versus the undeniable evidence he had presented. Her world was tilting, just as his had. He kept journals, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible. Dozens of them. Notebooks full of sketches, designs, thoughts. He told me to keep them safe. I never read them. He said they were private, just his work. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. A watchmaker's journal. It was an intimate record of a craftsman's soul. If there were answers to be found, they would be there, in the faded ink of those pages. Where are they? He asked. At our apartment, in his workshop. Take me there, Adrian said. Please, let's find the truth together. Lily looked from Adrian's intense, searching face to her brother's sleeping form. A nurse entered the room then, a cheerful woman with a kind smile. She addressed Lily. Good news, sweetie. Dr. Thorne was just here. An anonymous donor has set up a grant to cover all of Leo's medical expenses. The surgery is being scheduled for early next week. He's going to be okay. Lily stared at the nurse, her mind unable to process the words. She looked at Adrian, at his impassive, unreadable expression. Her eyes widened as the impossible truth dawned on her. Disbelief, confusion, and a fragile, burgeoning hope washed over her face. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. In that moment of silent understanding, she made her decision. She stood up. I'll get my coat, she said. The workshop was exactly as Adrian had imagined his own father's to be, only smaller and more crowded. It was a tiny, sacred space at the back of a modest apartment, a room where time had literally been taken apart and put back together. Every surface was covered with the tools of the trade. Tiny lathes, calipers, loops, and trays of meticulously organized screws and gears, each no bigger than a grain of sand. The air smelled of oil, brass, and old wood, a scent that acted like a key, unlocking a flood of memories for Adrian. He felt a dizzying sense of coming home, a feeling so potent it almost brought him to his knees. Lily moved through the room with a quiet reverence, her touch light on the worn wooden workbench. This was his world, she said softly. He was happier in here than anywhere else. She led him to a heavy wooden chest tucked under the bench. It was old, bound with iron straps, and locked with a heavy, intricate brass lock. "The journals are in here," she said. "He told me the key was hidden in a place only a watchmaker would look." Her eyes scanned the room, a flicker of uncertainty on her face. Adrian's gaze was drawn to a beautiful, handmade regulator clock hanging on the wall, its long pendulum swinging in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, elegant and precise. He walked over to it, his instincts guiding him. His own father had loved hiding things in plain sight. He reached up and carefully opened the glass face of the clock. Taped to the back of the heavy brass pendulum was a small, ornate key. Lily watched, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Recognition. As if she were seeing a piece of her father in him. She took the key, her fingers brushing his, and unlocked the chest. The lid creaked open, revealing stacks of leather-bound notebooks, filled from cover to cover with dense, spidery handwriting and intricate technical drawings. Lily lifted one out and handed it to Adrian. He opened it, his hands trembling slightly. The first page was dated 30 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the script of a man who thought in millimeters. And the first entry was not about gears or escapements. It was about a person. "Met Robert Vance today," it read. "A madman, an absolute raving genius. He came into the shop with a design that was either the most brilliant thing I've ever seen, or the ravings of a lunatic. Possibly both. He says he needs a craftsman, a partner, to help him build the impossible. I think I may have just met my destiny." Adrian sank onto a nearby stool, the strength gone from his legs. He read on, devouring the words, page after page, journal after journal. Lily sat beside him, silent, watching his face as he pieced together the story of their fathers. It was all there, laid bare in Thomas Keller's meticulous hand. The story of a friendship forged in the crucible of creation. They were two sides of the same coin. Robert, the visionary artist, the dreamer who wanted to paint the cosmos on a canvas the size of a thumbnail. And Thomas, the master craftsman, the pragmatist who knew how to turn those dreams into a tangible, ticking reality. The journals were filled with their collaboration. Arguments over the metallurgy of a specific alloy, ecstatic breakthroughs in escapement design, shared meals over cluttered workbenches. Thomas wrote of Robert's infectious passion, his frustrating refusal to compromise on his artistic vision. He wrote of his kindness, of how Robert had shared what little money he had when Thomas's wife first fell ill. They weren't just partners, they were brothers. The watch, which they had codenamed the Monarch, was their shared obsession, their child. They poured their souls into it. The initials R.V. and T.K. weren't an afterthought. They were the foundation of the entire project. As Adrian read, his own memories began to shift, to recontextualize. He remembered another man in the workshop sometimes, a quiet, serious presence his father had simply introduced as Tom. He'd been a boy, more interested in the finished product than the process, and had paid little attention. Now, those vague memories sharpened into the face from Lily's photograph. The kind, sad eyes of Thomas Keller. The journal entries grew more frantic as they neared the date of Robert's death. They had finally finished the Monarch. Robert had taken it to Geneva Masters for a final appraisal and to broker a sale that would set them both up for life. Thomas's entry from that day was filled with a nervous, soaring hope. The next entry was dated 2 days later. The handwriting was jagged, barely legible, the ink smudged by what could only have been tears. "Robert is gone. A light has gone out in the world. I can't breathe. They called from the hospital. It was too late. It's all gone. All the light is gone. Adrian had to stop, a raw, ragged sob catching in his throat. He was reading a eulogy for his father, written by a man he had thought was his greatest betrayer. He felt Lily's small hand on his shoulder, a silent, comforting presence. After a few moments, he composed himself and continued reading. The story took a dark turn. Thomas, shattered by grief, went to Geneva Masters to retrieve their watch. The owner, a man named Marcus Thorne, a name Adrian recognized with a jolt as the estranged uncle of Leo's doctor, was slick and unsympathetic. He claimed that since Robert was dead, their contract was void. He offered Thomas a pittance for his work, claiming the watch and its designs were now the property of the shop. Thomas, realizing he was being cheated, that Thorne intended to steal their life's work, panicked. He knew Thorne was a powerful, unscrupulous man. In a moment of desperate, grief-stricken clarity, he did the only thing he could think of. The journal described how he used his intimate knowledge of the shop's security, a system he himself had helped design, to get into the vault that night. He didn't steal the watch, he rescued it. His entry from that night was a torrent of guilt and justification. I have taken the monarch. It is not theft. I am protecting it for Robert's boy. Thorne has already filed a police report, named me as a suspect. I can't go to the police. It's my word against his. He will crush me. I have to disappear. I will find the boy, Adrian. I will give him his legacy. This I swear on my friendship. I'm sorry, Robert, I'm so sorry. But he never found him. The journals chronicled his desperate, failed attempts. He discovered Adrian had been swallowed by the foster care system, his name lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. Thorne's connections meant Thomas was a wanted man, forced to live in the shadows, always looking over his shoulder. He changed his name, moved cities, and eventually settled into a life of quiet anonymity, the dream of watchmaking excellence reduced to a humble repair shop. The monarch, their shared masterpiece, became his secret shame and his most sacred trust. It was a constant, ticking reminder of the friend he had lost and the promise he had failed to keep. He could never sell it. That would be the ultimate betrayal. He could only protect it, hoping that one day, by some miracle, fate would allow him to make things right. The last entry was written just a few days before his death. The handwriting was weak, but the words were clear. Lily, my bright star. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. The monarch is now your burden. I know it is too much to ask, but my time is up. In it lies the story of a great man, a dear friend named Robert Vance. It belongs to his son, Adrian. I do not know if he still lives or where he might be, but I have to believe that beauty finds its way home. Use it only when you have no other choice. Perhaps its magic is not in the gears, but in the journey. Forgive me. The journal slipped from Adrian's fingers, landing softly on the dusty floor. The silence in the workshop was absolute, profound. It was the silence of a truth finally, after 25 years being brought into the light. He looked at Lily. Her face was awash with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of vindication, of understanding, of a daughter's love for a father who had been vindicated. He wasn't a thief. He was a hero, in his own quiet, tragic way. Adrian reached out and took her hand. It was no longer the hand of a stranger, or the daughter of a suspect. It was the hand of the only other person in the world who could understand the weight of the legacy that now rested on their shoulders. He was a good man, Lily, Adrian said, his voice thick with emotion. Your father was a hero. The fortress around his heart had not just been shattered. It had been utterly demolished, and in its place, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. He had spent his life chasing a piece of his past, only to find that the most valuable thing he had lost was not a watch, but a connection to the man who had helped create it. He hadn't just found his father's watch, he had found his father's friend. And in doing so, he had found a family. The days that followed were a whirlwind of managed chaos and quiet revelation. Adrian's life, once a rigidly scheduled march of acquisitions and calculations, was now organized around hospital visiting hours and long, quiet conversations in a dusty workshop. The first order of business was Leo. Adrian leveraged his full influence, ensuring that Dr. Aris Thorne assembled the best pediatric cardiac team in the country. He sat with Lily in sterile waiting rooms, a silent pillar of support, while her brother underwent the grueling multi-hour surgery. In those tense hours, suspended between hope and fear, their bond solidified. They didn't talk about their fathers or the watch. They talked about Leo, his love for comic books, his terrible jokes, his quiet bravery. Adrian found himself sharing stories of his own lonely childhood, memories he hadn't allowed himself to access for years. He was no longer Adrian Vance, the titan of industry, but simply Adrian, a man sharing a moment of profound vulnerability with the girl who had inadvertently turned his world upside down. The surgery was a success. When Leo woke up, groggy but with a healthy pink hue already returning to his cheeks, the first person he saw was his sister, her face radiant with relief. The second person he saw was the imposing, well-dressed stranger who had been a constant presence at her side. "Are you Lily's new boyfriend?" Leo asked, his voice a small, raspy whisper. Lily flushed a brilliant crimson, and Adrian, for the first time in decades, let out a genuine, uninhibited laugh. It felt like a foreign muscle being used for the first time, rusty and surprising. He introduced himself simply as a friend of their father's, a statement that felt more true and profound than any other title he held. While Leo began the slow, arduous process of recovery, Adrian and Lily retreated to the workshop. It became their sanctuary, a place where they could piece together the past and begin to imagine a future. Together, they meticulously went through every one of Thomas's journals, organizing the designs, cross-referencing notes, and creating a complete archive of their father's collaboration. What emerged was a portrait of a creative partnership so intimate and symbiotic it was breathtaking. They found early sketches of the monarch, designs that were radically different from the final product, with notes in the margins from both men, arguing, refining, and inspiring each other. Adrian saw his own father's bold, artistic flourishes tempered and made possible by Thomas's grounded, mechanical genius. It became clear that the monarch wasn't Robert's watch, nor was it Thomas's. It belonged to them both, a testament to a friendship that had been tragically cut short. Among the journals, they made another discovery. Tucked into a hidden compartment in the old wooden chest was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It detailed every financial transaction of Thomas's life since he had fled. He had created a separate account, a trust, in Robert Vance's name. Every month, without fail, he had deposited a small percentage of his meager earnings into it. It wasn't much, but over 25 years it had grown. It was a debt he felt he owed, a penance for failing to find Adrian. A final note in the ledger read, "For Robert's boy, a seed from the tree we planted. I hope it is enough." Adrian stared at the neat columns of figures, a lump forming in his throat. This man, who had lived in poverty and fear, had been meticulously saving money for the son of the billionaire who had been hunting him. The irony was staggering. The quiet dignity of the act, the unwavering loyalty, was the final piece of the puzzle. Adrian closed the ledger. He knew what he had to do. He went after Marcus Thorne. It wasn't a hostile takeover or a boardroom ambush. It was a quiet, precise demolition. Adrian's legal team, armed with the detailed evidence from Thomas's journals and Adrian's own formidable resources, descended on Thorne's now floundering business. They uncovered a history of fraud, of stolen designs and cheated artists. Thorne, now an old, bitter man, had built his reputation on the genius of others, including the near theft of the monarch. Faced with irrefutable proof and the threat of public ruin and criminal charges, he crumbled. He was forced into a settlement that not only stripped him of his ill-gotten gains but also required a public retraction and apology for the theft accusation against Thomas Keller. The name of Lily's father was officially, publicly cleared. It was a quiet victory, one that played out in legal documents rather than headlines. But for Lily, it was everything. It was the restoration of her father's honor. One crisp autumn afternoon, a few weeks later, Adrian brought Lily not to the workshop, but to the gleaming headquarters of Vance Industries. He led her to the top floor, to a state-of-the-art design studio that looked more like a laboratory from the future than a watchmaker's shop. In the center of the room, on a velvet pedestal under a single spotlight, sat the monarch. It had been cleaned and serviced, its gold case gleaming, its complex face a mesmerizing dance of celestial bodies and intricate dials. "It's beautiful," Lily whispered, her eyes shining. "But it doesn't feel right, keeping it locked away. It was meant to be the first of many." "I agree," Adrian said. He gestured to the design tables around them, where a team of the world's best watchmakers and engineers stood waiting. On a large screen behind them was a 3D rendering of the monarch, deconstructed into its thousands of individual components. "Your father's journals contained more than just a story," Adrian explained, his voice filled with a new energy. "They contained a roadmap, blueprints for a dozen other complications they dreamed up, designs years ahead of their time. They didn't just create a watch, Lily. They created a new language of watchmaking." He picked up a sheaf of papers from a table. It was a business proposal. "I'm dissolving the Vance Industries subsidiary for luxury goods," he said, "and I'm starting a new company, a true partnership." He handed her the papers. The name on the top read, "Vance and Keller Horological Arts." Lily stared at the name, her hand trembling as she took the documents. Her name next to his, their fathers' names reunited. "I want you to run it with me," Adrian said. "Your father's craftsmanship and your heart, my father's vision and my resources. We'll finish what they started. We won't just recreate the monarch. We'll build all of them. We'll share their genius with the world." Tears welled in Lily's eyes as she looked from the proposal to Adrian's face. He was a different man from the one who had confronted her on the sidewalk. The hardness was gone, replaced by a warmth and a sense of purpose that seemed to illuminate him from within. He was no longer just chasing a ghost. He was building a legacy. A shared legacy. She didn't need to say yes. Her expression was answer enough. The final scene was not an ending, but a beginning. It took place a year later at the grand opening of the Vance and Keller flagship boutique on a street in Geneva, not far from where their father's dreams had almost been stolen. The event was the talk of the horological world. At the center of the showroom, in a museum-quality display case, was the original monarch, its pendulum swinging in a steady, reassuring rhythm, and surrounding it were the first pieces of the new collection, each named after a star or a constellation their fathers had studied together. The watches were a sensation, a perfect fusion of artistry and technical mastery. Adrian stood beside Lily, watching the crowd of admirers. He wore a simple, elegant suit, but the finest thing he wore was the quiet smile of contentment on his face. Lily, now a confident and poised young woman, was explaining the intricacies of a new perpetual calendar complication to a captivated journalist. Leo, fully recovered and bursting with a healthy 9-year-old's energy, was darting through the crowd, proudly showing off the simple, elegant Vance & Keller children's watch Adrian had designed just for him. Later, when the crowds had thinned, Adrian and Lily stood before the display case containing the Monarch. Its steady ticking was the heartbeat of the room, the heartbeat of their new life. "He would be so proud of you, Lily," Adrian said softly. "He would be proud of you both," she replied, her gaze shifting from the watch to him. "They both would be." Adrian looked at the watch, the object that had been the focal point of his pain for so long. He no longer saw it as a symbol of what he had lost. He saw it as a symbol of everything he had found. It was a story not of theft, but of unwavering loyalty. A story of a friendship that transcended death, and of a promise that had, against all odds, finally been kept. He felt a presence beside him, and turned to see Leo, who slipped his small hand into Adrian's. Adrian squeezed it gently, a feeling of profound, unexpected peace settling over him. He was no longer the lonely king of a sterile empire. He was part of something much richer, much more complex. He was part of a family, a story, a legacy. The tears that welled in his eyes were not the bitter tears of a grieving boy, but the cleansing tears of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found his way home. The watch ticked on, measuring not just the passing of seconds, but the beginning of a future built on the redeemed and beautiful promise of the past.